If you search for how many microplastic particles your toothbrush puts into your mouth every year, you will find three different answers. One says about 14,000, another says up to 88,000, a third says over 2 million. That is not a small discrepancy, that is two completely different orders of magnitude depending on which article you happen to click on. And normally when I see numbers spread that far apart on a topic, my first assumption is that someone is exaggerating. Sometimes that is exactly what is happening. But in this specific case, something more interesting is going on. And understanding why these three numbers disagree will teach you more about how to read health science than any single statistic could. So today I am not just going to tell you what the research says about toothbrushes and microplastics. I am going to show you why three groups of credible scientists looked at the same basic question and walked away with answers that differ by a factor of more than 100. By the end, you will know which number actually applies to your daily life, and you will know how to spot this same pattern the next time a wellness headline throws a big, scary number at you. Here is the plan for this video. First, the direct measurement studies, the ones that physically simulated brushing and counted actual particles, and what they found. Second, the modeling study out of Jilin University in China that produced the much larger million-particle figure and exactly what assumption explains the gap. Third, what these particles are actually made of and why your brush bristle material matters more than the brand name on the handle. Fourth, what the current science says and does not yet say about whether this exposure translates into any measurable health effect. And fifth, the specific low-effort changes that reduce this exposure regardless of which number turns out to be closest to the truth for you personally. I read the primary research on everyday materials and explain what current evidence does and does not support. I am not a physician, and nothing here is medical advice. This particular episode is going to lean a little more on the practice of evaluating evidence itself, because the toothbrush story is a genuinely useful case study in why two studies asking what sounds like the same question can produce very different numbers without either one being wrong. Let us start with the studies that measured rather than modeled. A 2024 study published in Environmental Pollution tested a range of oral care products, including toothbrushes, toothpaste, mouthwash, and floss, sold across a wide consumer market. Every single product released measurable microplastic particles. Toothbrushes released far more than any other category, somewhere between 30 and 120 particles per brushing session depending on the brand. If you brush twice a day, every day, for a year, that range works out to roughly 22,000 to 88,000 particles annually. A separate study published in 2025 in the Microchemical Journal took a more controlled approach. Researchers built a three-dimensional printed dental arch out of zirconium, a stable material that would not itself shed particles and confound the results, and used it to simulate twice-daily brushing with a range of commercial toothbrush models over a full week. They used Raman spectroscopy, a technique that identifies materials by how they scatter laser light, to confirm exactly what was being shed and rule out contamination from anything else in the test setup. Every toothbrush tested released particles. The cheapest brand in the study released the most. Their average finding was about 39 particles per day across both brushing sessions, which extrapolates to roughly 14,000 particles per year. Notice what these two studies have in common. Both physically brushed something, real bristles against a real or simulated tooth surface, and then counted what came off using direct imaging techniques. This is about as close to ground truth as toxicology research gets for this kind of question. The numbers differ by a factor of about 4 between them, partly because of different brushing techniques, different product selections, and different test durations, which is a completely normal range of variation for this type of physical measurement. Now here is where the third number comes from, and this is the part of the story that almost never gets explained when people repeat the headline. A study published in 2025 by researchers at Jilin University in China took a different methodological approach entirely. Rather than running a fixed number of brushing simulations and counting particles directly, they combined laboratory release rate data with a large population usage survey, the kind of study where researchers ask thousands of people detailed questions about how they actually use a product, how hard they brush, how long their sessions last, how often they replace their brush, and what brand and bristle type they use. They found something specific in their release rate testing that turns out to be the key to the whole discrepancy. The rate at which a toothbrush sheds particles is not constant. It increases rapidly in the first period of use as the bristles begin to wear, then continues increasing more gradually after that. A brand new toothbrush releases relatively few particles. A toothbrush nearing the end of its useful life, frayed and worn, releases dramatically more. The researchers used this changing release curve combined with real-world usage patterns from their survey, including the fact that many people keep using a toothbrush well past the point dentists recommend replacing it, to model a full year of realistic variable use rather than a fixed, controlled test. When you model an entire year using a release curve that climbs as the brush wears down, instead of measuring a brand new brush for a single week, the cumulative annual number climbs substantially higher. Their model produced an estimate of at least 2,300,000 particles per year for toothbrush use, and a separate, comparably large figure for toothpaste. This is the critical detail. The Gillen researchers were explicit in their own paper that this is a modeled estimate built on population-level assumptions, not a direct physical count from a single controlled experiment. They were equally explicit about something else, something that almost no outlet repeating their headline number ever mentions. Their own paper states that the toothbrushes and toothpaste commonly used by the population they studied do not appear to directly contribute to measurable health risk from this exposure. The researchers who produced the biggest number in this entire conversation are also the researchers most clearly stating that the number on its own has not been shown to translate into harm. I want to pause on this because it is more useful than any single number in this video. These three studies are not in conflict. They are answering three different versions of a similar question. What does a new toothbrush release under controlled short-term testing? That gives you the 14,000 and the 88,000 figures. What does a toothbrush release across its entire realistic lifespan, factoring in wear, replacement habits, and population behavior? That gives you the 2 million figure. Both are legitimate scientific approaches. Neither is fraudulent, but they are not interchangeable, and reporting the largest number without its modeling context, the way most coverage of this topic does, creates a false impression of certainty that the original researchers never claimed. This pattern repeats constantly in health and environmental science. A controlled lab measurement gives you a precise, conservative number under specific conditions. A population model gives you a broader, larger number under realistic but more variable conditions. The honest answer to how many particles your toothbrush puts into your mouth is not a single figure. It is a range that depends heavily on how worn your specific brush is, how hard you brush, and how long you wait before replacing it. Regardless of which number applies most closely to you, the underlying mechanism is consistent across every study on this topic. Toothbrush bristles are typically made from nylon, polypropylene, or polybutylene terephthalate, three different plastic polymers, each with slightly different stiffness and wear characteristics. The Gillen study found that polypropylene was the most common material identified in the particles their toothbrush testing released, and noted that the smallest fragments, under 50 micrometers, were associated specifically with brushes made from polyethylene terephthalate, a more rigid plastic. Smaller particles matter biologically because particle size is one of the main factors determining how easily a fragment can cross tissue barriers, including, in theory, absorption through the mouth's mucous membranes or the digestive tract if swallowed with saliva. The actual physical mechanism is simple. Bristles are bundles of plastic fiber under constant mechanical stress, bending and flexing thousands of times per brushing session against a hard enamel surface. Over weeks of use, that repeated flexing fatigues the polymer at a microscopic level, and individual fiber tips fray and shed. This is the same reason a toothbrush visibly looks worn after a few months. The fraying you can see with your eyes is the large-scale version of the same process, producing particles too small to see at all. Here is where I want to be as precise as the researchers themselves were. Multiple narrative reviews published through 2025 and into 2026 have examined microplastic exposure from dental sources broadly, including toothbrushes, toothpaste, floss, and even dental materials like clear aligners and composite resins. These reviews consistently describe laboratory evidence that microplastic particles can be taken up by oral cells and can trigger oxidative stress and inflammatory responses in cell culture and animal models. They also consistently state that direct human evidence linking toothbrush-derived microplastic exposure specifically to any diagnosed health condition does not currently exist. This is not a contradiction. It means the biological plausibility, the mechanism by which this could matter, is reasonably well supported in laboratory settings. The human outcome data, the proof that it actually does matter at the exposure levels people experience from brushing their teeth, has not yet been established. Researchers in this field describe the connection as biologically plausible but not yet proven, which is a meaningfully different statement than either dismissing the concern entirely or treating it as a settled health crisis. I am not going to tell you this is nothing. The exposure is real and consistently measured across independent labs using different methods. I am also not going to tell you it has been shown to cause a specific health problem, because that claim is not supported by the current evidence, and several of the very researchers who produced the largest exposure estimates said so directly in their own publication. None of this requires abandoning a basic hygiene habit that genuinely protects your dental and cardiovascular health in ways that are extremely well established. It requires a few specific, low-effort adjustments. The first and most consistently supported recommendation across every study reviewed here is simple replacement timing. The Jilin research specifically identified worn, aging bristles as the primary driver of increased particle release. Dental associations already recommend replacing a toothbrush every 3 to 4 months, primarily for bacterial hygiene reasons. This research gives you a second, independent reason to actually follow that guidance, rather than stretching a toothbrush's life by another month or two out of habit. The second adjustment is brushing technique. Several studies noted that more aggressive brushing pressure increased fiber fatigue and particle shedding. Using a soft bristled brush with gentle, controlled pressure rather than hard scrubbing reduces mechanical stress on the bristles, which both protects your gum tissue, an established dental health benefit, and reduces the rate of bristle degradation. The third adjustment is material choice, with an honest caveat. Toothbrushes with natural bristle materials exist, but the research community has not yet produced controlled comparison studies measuring whether they shed meaningfully less microplastic than synthetic bristles in equivalent use conditions. If reducing plastic exposure generally matters to you, a natural bristle option is a reasonable choice to make. I am not going to claim it is scientifically proven to reduce your specific particle count, because that comparison study does not yet exist, and claiming otherwise would be exactly the kind of overstatement I am trying to help you recognize in this video. Here is the detail that ties this whole video together, and it is worth remembering well beyond toothbrushes. The researchers who produced the 2,300,000 particle figure, the single biggest, scariest number in this entire topic, are the same researchers who explicitly concluded that common toothbrushes and toothpaste did not appear to pose a direct health risk in their own study population. The largest number and the most reassuring conclusion came from the exact same paper. That single fact tells you almost everything you need to know about how to read health journalism going forward. A big number by itself tells you almost nothing about actual risk. The number needs the context that produced it, the assumptions behind it, and the conclusion the original researchers actually drew from their own data. Strip that context away, and you can make any study sound like an emergency, even one whose own authors said it probably is not. So which number is right, 14,000, 88,000, or 2,300,000? The honest answer is that they are all measuring something slightly different, and your actual number depends on how worn your toothbrush is right now, today, sitting in your bathroom. What does not depend on which study you trust most is the action available to you. Replace your brush on schedule. Brush gently rather than aggressively. Consider a natural bristle option if it matters to you, while understanding that the comparative evidence there is still developing. These changes work regardless of which of the three numbers turns out to describe your personal exposure most accurately. If you want the next health headline taken apart with the same care, the number explained rather than just repeated, subscribing gets you that every time I post. I will see you in the next